Well, welcome to another episode of the Scriptural Mormonism Podcast. I'm your host, Robert Ballin, live here from the B. Roberts Foundation office here in Holiday, Utah. We have a very special guest. I think most people who follow Mormon studies will know him, but it's actually Brant Gardner. Brant, thanks for coming on to today's episode. I do appreciate it.
Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks for accepting. I'm sure those involved in say Mormon studies and Book of Mormon studies know who you are, unless of course they've been living under a rock for the last couple of years. But just in case they're an outlier, how about you give an introduction to your good self? What's your educational background? Have you always been a Latter-day Saint? What got you interested in Book of Mormon studies in general, but also this particular topic we'll be discussing specifically as well?
Okay. Yes, I've always been a Latter-day Saint, grew up that way. That doesn't mean I didn't have the time when I had to find out whether I was a Latter-day Saint because I believed it or because I was raised that way. So I had to make a conscious decision. And so I'm a converted, born in the covenant kind of guy. Educational background, oddly enough, it started with Quetzalcoatl. When I was on my mission, I was in Spain, and I was really interested before I left in archaeology, and I'd read Thomas Ferguson's One Fold, One Shepherd, and so I kind of talked a lot about that with people on my mission. And when I got back, speaking Spanish now, I decided that what I really needed to do was to read some of those original sources in Spanish so that when someone said to me, "Why do you believe that Quetzalcoatl is Jesus Christ?" I could say, "Well, I've read the sources." And so I did, and I started reading the sources in Spanish, and I started collecting as many of them as I could. I read Joe Allen's dissertation where he looked at most of the sources, and I realized they didn't really say what we said they said. And this whole idea that Quetzalcoatl was Jesus Christ didn't really hold up when you went to the actual sources. From there, I just fell in love with Mesoamerica, and so that's kind of where things began to pivot, and then I ended up with a master's degree in anthropology with a specialty in Mesoamerican ethnohistory. And since there aren't too many people who know what ethnohistory is, basically it's trying to create history from people who don't necessarily have a long written tradition of history. So you're kind of tweaking out as many things as you possibly can from the sources. And I spent a fair amount of time doing that, just completely leaving all this Quetzalcoatl stuff, as far as the church behind. I was just immersed in Mesoamerica and in the scholarly world. And then I didn't pick it up again until quite a long time later. We had left. We got to the point where we realized I had too much student debt and I needed to pay it off, and we needed a job. And so, I took a year off, and that year has turned into 50 or 60. I don't know how many now. But yeah, I never got back to finish. But I did get back at some point to looking at the Book of Mormon and comparing it to Mesoamerica. And that's kind of where all of my interests started to fold in together. And obviously, at some point in time, I had to write up what I had thought about Quetzalcoatl and Jesus Christ. So I've done that a couple of times. And then you're apparently turning to one of them.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get up here. You have an excurse. By the way, Brant, it should be noted, has written a number of books, including this volume, which is part of a 6-volume set. You actually have the setback. Second Witness, Analytical and Contextual Commentary on the Book of Mormon. You also have 2 most recent books, I might just mention them now: Engraven upon Plates, Printed upon Paper, and the Plates of Mormon, a Book of Mormon Study Guide that just came out this year as well. I got all of these for the office here in BHR. So, but you do have a lengthy excursus, Quetzalcoatl, a malleable mythology, which goes on for a couple of pages, beginning on page 353 of the Eternity 5 volume, which is volume 5 on the 6-volume set. And you published a shorter essay a number of years previous to that in Sunstone magazine. Though we will hold that against you that it being Sunstone.
I'll give you the short history of that excursus in Second Witness. I had written one after the one in Sunstone, and there's probably stories to be told about that one as well. But I had written a different one, and I thought it was okay, and I really wanted something about Quetzalcoatl in that commentary. And so I sent it off to my editor, Robina Anderson, and Lamina read it and she says, this isn't any good. She says, like, you can't use this. This is not good enough. And she said, either get rid of it or rewrite it. So I said, well, okay. So I ended up rewriting it, and ended up in the form that you see it there. But it was there because the first one I gave her was rejected soundly. She liked this one better.
That's cool. So maybe before we kind of begin like the problems of this kind of apologetic, do you want to give like a brief history of like how it became so popular in LDS circles?
It's part of a general trend in history that Latter-day Saints really love the Book of Mormon, and because we love the Book of Mormon, we really want to support it, and we want to find things that bolster our faith in it. And from the very beginning, Latter-day Saints have looked to archaeology to find things that might help us understand the Book of Mormon. And that led early on to thinking that the mound builders were part of the Book of Mormon. That came out of traditions that were already in place at the time. This whole idea that there was an ancient race behind the mounds was part of what was happening at that time. So that was pretty easy to do. And then things started to shift, and people found Stevenson Catherwood's book that started showing all these wonderful ruins that were coming out of Central America. And so everybody said, well, okay, these are prettier ruins, so therefore they must be the ones that are part of the Book of Mormon. And then people, of course, decided that we ought to go look at the legends and the stories. And the first people who started looking at them didn't go back to original sources. They went to secondhand sources. And the secondhand sources in the whole story of how all of this develops, the secondhand sources in English were citing sources that were already secondhand in Spanish. And what had happened is there was a native story, and the Spaniards had sort of put something on top of that, and then somebody else reported that, and then when we got it in English, we distorted it yet one more time. And that's how Jesus Christ ended up being Quetzalcoatl, is this long string of things, none of which ever went back to the actual original sources. They went back, the best you can do is get back to the Spanish sources, and usually later Spanish sources.
Yeah, in fact, most recently I read a book by an Or LDS author. I'll actually just share the slides because he kind of goes through this apologetic. And I can understand, like, say, maybe on the face value, a well-meaning Latter-day Saint might think, well, it's obviously Jesus. I'll just share the screen. So this actually comes from a book, Rye Weldon, who wrote a number of volumes on the Book of Mormon. This particular book, Other Sheep, Book of Mormon Evidences, published by the Or LDS Church in 1958. Some of the parallels would include how Quetzalcoatl's birth was accompanied by the appearance of a new star and mysterious omens and wonders in the heavens, traditionally solemn as to his childhood years. Manly P. Hall says, quote, "We read of the temptation of Quetzalcoatl, how during his penance the spirit of evil came to him and tried to divert him from his course. In another place is the account of his fasting for 40 days, which later became a definite part of the Mexican ritual. Quetzalcoatl had power of bidding the winds to be hushed, hence he is called God the Wind. Quetzalcoatl describes the death god, victory over death. One of his many appellations in the ancient language signifies a vine or juice thereof. G, the morning star, was his symbol. H, Spence says that Quetzalcoatl died and was invisible for 4 days, after which he was resurrected and ascended his throne. And between his death and resurrection, he tarried in the underworld.
Okay, go back to the first one of those. Let's just talk about those. That's a good introduction.
Yeah. Let me just go through this. Let me just pop it back up here. Yeah.
There we go. So we'll start with the first one.
That his birth was accompanied by the appearance of a new star and mysterious omens and wonders in the heavens.
Yeah. That one's kind of complicated because it's hard to know what they're actually referring to. When you get back into the actual earliest sources, there is a star that's associated with him, but it's associated with his death, not his birth. I'm not aware of the appearance of any new star or any mysterious wonders in the heavens associated with Quetzalcoatl. There are mysterious wonders that are associated with the Spanish coming, but there's nothing that I know of in any of the sources that would support anything in that letter A. Now, it's true that tradition is silent as to his early childhood years, almost. There are a couple of sources, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. I've got something else I want to show. But there is something about his childhood years, and it doesn't fit into the legends, and so they don't mention it. The next one, the temptation of Quetzalcoatl. This part is true. There is a temptation scene. What everybody seems to leave out is that his fall is associated with him having incest. And at least in one story. The actual story reads that he has sex with his sister. But it turns out that the word that they're using for sister also could mean a female priest. So may not have been the family, but still it was somebody he wasn't supposed to have sex with. And that's what accounts for his fall. The 40 days, that's not part of it. That's in addition to the legend. Quetzalcoatl is the god of the wind, but it has nothing to do with him being the winds being hushed. He's the winds that sweep in the rain clouds. So there's nothing about him being hushed. Destroys the god of death? No. There is a victory over death only in that he dies and he is resurrected as a deity. But he doesn't, there is nothing at all that has to do with the god of death. I think they're misinterpreting a legend that has to do with him defeating Tezcatlipoca, which is his twin. And even that one gets mixed up where it's sort of like, you've got a good and bad yin yang kind of good guy, and it's not even that. Both of them are good and both of them have bad points, and they're kind of fighting each other. The idea of sort of creator twins happens in a lot of mythologies, and that's a better thing than this whole idea of death god. F, one of his appellations in the ancient language, no, not true at all. I don't know where that comes from. Has no basis in fact. Morning star was a symbol? Yes, it came when he died. What people don't mention is that the morning star is also associated with warfare, and one of the important historical connections with Quetzalcoatl is with warfare. Spence says that he died, was invisible for 4 days, and then he ascended. Yes, he died. Yes, he ascended. I don't remember the 4 days. It's entirely possible, however, because 4 is the time of completion, or the number of completion in Mesoamerica. So it wouldn't be surprising to have 4 days. And then between death and resurrection, he tarried in the underworld. There are things about him going into the underworld, but they're not always associated with his death and resurrection. Timing in mythology is a little bit unusual. And in many of the cases, the stories about him in the underworld have to do with creation and the creation of man. So when you look at lists like this, you go, okay, yeah, I can see where they got them, maybe. But they're kind of fanciful, and they're rewritten to make it sound more Christ-like than they really are.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm sure Weldon meant well, but and I can understand, like, say, why someone who's well-meaning, but when it comes to the sources, maybe naive, might see, well, Days of Darkness, Terran in the Underworld. We don't have any idea of his childhood, even if that is incorrect. Might see, like, well, it kind of sounds like Jesus, but as we'll see here, it's problematic and it's also parallelomania. But
Yeah.
well,
Well, and that's the problem with this whole idea of parallel lists. You can always make them sound better than they are. And if you don't spend the time to actually learn more about them, then they sound really good. Let me share my screen here for a second.
Sure, go ahead.
And now what am I trying to do? All right, there we go. What I wanted to do with this is to kind of give people a brief idea of what you have to do to get the answer to why not Quetzalcoatl, because everybody sort of begins with that assumption. That's kind of what's built into us. And the first thing we have to understand is what kind of sources are available to us. And when you're doing any kind of history, the oldest sources are supposed to be the best. And so any pre-Columbian source would be really wonderful. The problem is in pre-Columbian sources, we don't have very much language unless you get to the Maya. And in the Maya, the actual Maya texts don't have a heck of a lot about the mythology of a Quetzalcoatl. So we don't get a lot of, written things. We can get a few things because they are the picture books and we can learn how to read them, but we learn how to read them based, unfortunately, on post-conquest texts. So we have some pre-Columbian sources. We have to deal with them. We have to understand them, but we have to understand them because we have some text that we can help sort of push back. The next one are documents that are very close to the conquest. And so you've got 1521 is when Cortez is coming and conquering Tenochtitlan. And so between 1520, 1570, this is that first early generation where everybody's getting to know each other forcefully. But the closer you get to the conquest, the better your sources should be. Then the next set, maybe 1570 to 1650, you can still get some pretty interesting stuff here, but you're getting farther away. And so those that are further away have more opportunity to be altered by somebody interpreting them, saying, this is what I read and this is what it means. And then, of course, you've got the modern scholastic interpretations, and some of them are good, some of them are, kind of ho-hum. It's like any scholastic endeavor. There's always good, bad, and ugly. For those who are interested in it, this is the book you were showing me earlier. That's the one. For people who really want to know what the sources are like, this won't tell you that Christ is Quetzalcoatl, but if you really want to know what sources to look at, you really have to consult this book. This is the masterwork that looks at everything and pulls all of the information into one place and ranks it, what's older, what's newer. If you're going to be serious about looking at this, if you haven't consulted this, you just haven't done your homework. You have to see that volume. Now, here is a list of sources that one could look at. And you'll notice there's the two columns here that I think are important. Well, they're all important, I guess. So the first one is, who's the author? What's the work's name? That's all on your left. And then the year of composition. And the older they are, the better they should be. But the next thing that's important is who's the author? Who wrote this? And of course, early things that we get in Spanish, they're early, we have to treat them, we have to know what they are. But things that are early and are also in the Aztec language should be more important than some particularly later Spanish things. And what you'll notice in any of the discussions of what you get about Quetzalcoatl and Jesus Christ, If you look down to the column where it has Nawa and Nawat, or Nawa in Spanish, those are sources that you never see cited. They don't show up, even though they're extremely important. And the reason is they don't say what people want them to say. These are the ones where you find out that, for example, Quetzalcoatl is supposed to hate human sacrifice. Well, in the land de los soles, he actually kills his uncles and takes their skulls and makes a drinking cup out of the top of their skull, which is kind of unchristlike. But this is a very early and a legend written in Aztec, and you can't just throw it away and say, well, that doesn't fit, and therefore, I can ignore it. So these are the sources. The earlier you go, the less Christian he appears. The later you get, the more Christian he appears, until you get to Diego de Duran, down here in this 1579 to 1581. Things really start looking very Christian right at that point in time. But they don't look like Christ. They look Christian because his argument is that this was St. Thomas who came over. And so there's a long literature of St. Thomas literature that says that from the old world, Thomas Didymus, one of the apostles, comes to the new world. He's the apostle to the Indias. And so, of course, he's going to end up with the Indians, and he teaches them Christianity. All right, next thing. Go through a couple of these, and then we'll see if I miss anything. One of the things that happens is people will get the Quetzalcoatl name, and they'll start looking at meanings for the name. Quetzalcoatl really means the Quetzal bird and serpent. So Quetzal is the bird, and Coatl is serpent. And so Quetzalcoatl is basically this Quetzal feathered bird or snake. And that's the Aztec name. And you have to remember that the Aztecs are very late. Well, there's other names for him. And what happens is there's also some associations with it. So in Aztec, it happens that the name for a twin is a cocoa. And so that sounds like the serpents. And so twin and coat kind of sound similar, and the Quetzal bird is precious, and therefore it's precious twin. And so you get that, and you'll see people say, well, this means something. But it only means that in the Aztec language. It doesn't mean that when it goes anywhere to any other language. So once you take it out of the Aztec language, it doesn't have that meaning anymore. Let's see, what did I do for the next one? There we go. So you get these three names for Quetzalcoatl. Quetzalcoatl is the Aztec name. Kukulkan is the Northern Maya name, and Cucumats is the Quiche name. And all three of these names have the exact same meaning. So Quetzal and Cucul both are for the Quetzal bird. And then what happened in Quiche is there's a change from the K to a glottal stop, which is the Cucumats. So Kukul and Kukul are the same. What's really important here, though, is if you look at that last part, the Kan and the Mats, these are two different Maya languages. And at one point in time, there was no separation between them. And the Proto-Maya word for snake is Kan. What that means is that this Kukumats name is applied to this deity after those two languages split. And those two languages split after the end of the Book of Mormon, which means that this Kukumats and Kukulkan are probably terms that have come into Maya after the end of the Book of Mormon. And historically, what we know is that there is a Toltec people somewhere around 900 AD that are coming into this area, are terribly influential, and are bringing the feathered serpent into this area. And the Maya legends say that, these Toltec people brought Kukulkan with them. So when people say Quetzalcoatl is, also among the Maya, that's true, but not before 900 AD. So, 500 years after the Book of Mormon is over, we finally get those. So, the name isn't as good as you think it is. The next one that we always get is he's the white god. And of course, those of us who are racially biased, I guess, assume that white means Caucasian. And it didn't. The sort of twin for Quetzalcoatl was Tezcatlipoca. And Quetzalcoatl is white and Tezcatlipoca is black. But that's because of the colors that are associated with the corners of the world. And so it's sort of like saying the North and the South version. So he's not the white god in skin color. He's the North god, or the East or the West. They kind of mix all these colors up depending on where you are. But it's a world direction color, not a skin color. When we get an early document from the Aztecs talking about the Spaniards, and of course they noticed that the Spaniards were different. They noticed their beards. But when they talk about the skin color, there's a fascinating statement that says they're whiter than we are. So they didn't think they were qualitatively different. There was just, they're whiter than we are. So this whole idea of the white god being somehow unusual, that's a modern imposition on the text and doesn't belong there. You will see this one frequently, this whole idea of the virgin birth. There is a mythology of a virgin birth with Chimaman. She swallows a jade bead and becomes impregnated. But that's not a Quetzalcoatl story. That's a Huitzilopochtli story. And somehow people forget about that, drop out the god that was associated with it, and just toss that legend onto Quetzalcoatl. Doesn't belong there. It's not his legend. It's not the way he was born. So when you hear people saying, well, it could be Christ because of the virgin birth, they got the wrong god there, the wrong story. Aversion to human sacrifice. This one's complicated, and I won't go into too many reasons, but some of this is Spanish elaboration. I mentioned that in the Leyenda, we have Quetzalcoatl, and it's also in Anales de Cuautitlan, the other Aztec source. In both of those, he's sacrificing his uncles. So yeah, he does that. The next thing that's interesting is it's apparently related to the Spaniards trying to improve their position, or the natives trying to improve their position with the Spaniards, because it was rather obvious that the Spaniards didn't like human sacrifice. And so obviously they said, well, no, Quetzalcoatl tried to make sure that we didn't do that. It was somebody else's fault. He tried to fix it for us. When you go to the Maya and you look at their legends, what they say is, oh no, we never did sacrifice until Quetzalcoatl made us do it. So the response of the people to the Spaniards was the same. We're pretty good. Somebody else made us do it, or there was a problem. But when you get to the Maya, it's, yeah, Quetzalcoatl made us do it, which frankly might have been true because that goes back to the Toltec invasion in like 900 to 1200. And these changes in the name, Kukulkan, Umats, etc. Taught Christian principles. Some of them he did, but Quetzalcoatl was a culture giver, a culture bringer, and so he brought everything. He taught them how to do everything. All culture, everything that was good was coming from him, and that's kind of far beyond just Christian principles. What happened is Spaniards later just pulled those out because they were Christianizing the legends. And then the myth of the return. This is another one that you'll get frequently. He came and he said he would come back, and obviously that ties to Christ saying he would return. The problem is this whole myth of the return, you can't find it in native sources. The only place the myth of the return shows up is when it's connected to the arrival of the Spanish. It's only in Spanish sources, and it's only there when it is convenient to predict the fact that the Spaniards are coming. So this myth of the return, it really looks like something that the Spaniards have sort of made up to justify what they were doing. All right. Let's go back. What do I want to go back to? How do I get out of this thing? Stop sharing. There we go. Now I'm back. Technology. Old people and technology.
Technology works, but it won't need it to work the most. It just kind of decides you frazzle. So, yeah.
So anyway, that's a quick overview of some of the problems that we have. A lot of the rest of them we have, and we didn't talk about this book.
I think we should, though, because it's pretty popular, even some like LDS circles.
Yeah, it is. And, when you get the He Walked the Americas and, the cover here, it's pretty clear that the intent is to link it to a very Christian Christ kind of person here. L. Taylor Hanson was not LDS. She, wrote this because, she pulled all of this information around. There's two things that anybody who is serious about investigating this need to know. The first is that no matter where you go in the book, what you will not find are footnotes. So the entire book is written without any documentation for anything that she says. Okay? There is a bibliography. When you go through the bibliography, you will find that they are all late secondary sources and none of them are primary sources. So she's getting, what we're getting in this book is like third-hand interpretations of second-hand interpretations, and sometimes even fourth-hand interpretations. So the fact that there's no way to check on her, the fact that the sources that she uses are very late. The next thing is, because she goes over a wide range of things, I can't say how well she did with many of the things she does because I don't handle that literature. But when you get into the literature for Central Mexico, that's literature I was familiar with. And so when she would start talking about the stories, I knew where she was coming from. I knew which stories were being referenced. And she was not accurate on any of them. So from my experience, knowing what the original source was and knowing what she said, I have no confidence in any of the rest of the things she said because I knew what distortions were already there in the ones that she represented. So it's a very popular book. It's written, more easily read than many of the things that we nerds put out. But it doesn't qualify. It doesn't have the connections. It doesn't go back to original sources, and it just skims over things, makes it look much better than it really is.
Yeah, I read the book as well a couple of years ago. As much as I like him, Jeff Lindsay kind of mentions the book in one of his Book of Mormon nugget pages. So I decided just to see what it was like, and I wasn't impressed. It's like, I put my cards on the table. As with yourself, I believe the Book of Mormon to be historical text, albeit a 19th century translation and so forth. So, I'm sympathetic towards those who want to find evidence for the Book of Mormon, and I'm sure you do so. But at the same time, I just don't think it's a very good apologetic. And as I said, the impetus for me inviting you on was, and let me say, I actually like the guys that have been on their show before with Don Bradley, but Ward Radio actually had this episode where they were actually reading from that book. And on the comment section, I said like, no, it's a very poor book. I'm sure she went well, but like it's a very pretty research book. Reach out to Brant Gardner. And I don't think they did. So I decided to reach out to you instead. But it's very, as you know, like yourself, it's a very popular volume and so forth. But you were about to say something anyway.
And I'm not sure what I was going to say. But on the idea of it being popular volume, the problem is that it is easier to write a popular volume if you write what people want you to say than it is to become a popular volume if you actually try to tell people what the actual history was. We're not as interested in that because it isn't as convenient. It doesn't say exactly what we want to say. Now, here's the thing that I think is kind of interesting. It goes back to something we talked about at the beginning, which is, why do we want to do this? Why do we want? And one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating was one of the comments from, and I think it might have been, I don't think it was Martin Harris. I think it might have been David Whitmer. David Whitmer made the mention that the witnesses to the Book of Mormon were nervous when they were first putting their signatures on this, because they said, here is a Book of Mormon that says that there were all these civilizations here and we don't know where they are. What's going to happen? And they got a revelation where the Lord says, this will be revealed to them out of the ground. And basically saying archaeology will help you understand this. And then they were feeling better. And then they took pretty much everything that came out of the ground into archaeology and said, well, that must have been it. So they went overboard. But the idea that we really want to have this, this certainty because of something, we really would like to have that. And it's never that easy.
And this kind of brings up something. So if someone were like, say, to be disillusioned with the whole Quetzalcoatl issue, and they would ask you, Brant, like, what would your advice be when it comes to, say, the evidence and the status of the Book of Mormon, and where should we go and what should we look for? How would you respond to that?
I think what you do in the Book of Mormon is you realize that the best source of information in the Book of Mormon is the Book of Mormon text itself, but that you have to change your opinions of how you look at the text. We have inherited a concept from the Bible to sort of expect this miraculous God-breathed document that is somehow foreign to humanity and has been placed in our hands. And of course, the miraculous translation of the Book of Mormon feeds into that. But if we remember that this is a text that was written by people, then we could look at it and say, wait a second, if a human being wrote this text, they should write it the way we see human beings write. And so they should reflect their culture, the things that they're interested in, the times they live in. Those things should be reflected in the text. So rather than say, what I really want to do is find some archaeological monument that therefore is going to prove the Book of Mormon, what I want to do is to see how to take the Book of Mormon and set it against a cultural context and time period where those two not only line up, but that cultural context starts teaching us things about the Book of Mormon that we would not otherwise know. It's sort of like what you do with the Bible when you say, I can read the Bible in English and not know anything about Greek, and I can read through it and I can get something from it. And then I can read something like, the eye is single to the glory of God, and I can say, that's cool. I have no idea what that means, but that's a cool phrase. I think I'll use that and I'll repeat it. And it never means anything. So, what does it mean to have your eyes single? Well, I asked a Greek professor of mine at BYU once, and I said, what does this mean? He says, well, the Greek term isn't single, it's unmixed. And he said, I don't know if that helps you. And at the time, no, it didn't help me at all. I mean, have an eye unmixed to the glory of God. Okay, that still doesn't help me. But when you realize that in the ancient world, in that Mediterranean world, they believed that the eye did not receive light, but actually sent out light. And it was based on the light that was inside of you. And the lights that they're familiar with are oil lamps. And if you have a pure flame, you get a nice clear flame and a clear light. But if that oil has impurities in it, it's going to flicker and it's not going to be as clear. And so an unmixed light would be like a lamp source. And if it's inside of you, you're looking at God through clouded lenses. You're not seeing God correctly. So if you have it unmixed, it's, you have a clear soul. Your light is clear and you're seeing God. And all of a sudden you read that and you go, oh, okay, yeah, that sort of makes some sense now. We do the same thing with, we all know that the Bible tells us to turn the other cheek. But that isn't what the Bible says. What it says is if someone should strike you on the right cheek, turn the left also. Okay, why does that make a difference? Well, think about that for a second. If I'm right-handed and I'm going to hit you, let's see if I get this right here. Is it the left cheek and then the right? Anyway, whatever it is, you've got the right hand slapping onto the left cheek. And anyway, it's a backhanded, which is a real insult in that world. And so what Christ is saying is, if somebody is going to really insult you like that, you can't fight back. You have to turn the other cheek and say, at least treat me like a human and an equal instead of like an inferior. And all of a sudden, this concept that you're supposed to just roll over, that isn't what it's saying. It's saying stand up for yourself, in a time when you can't fight back because the Romans are more powerful. So when you put the Bible in a historical context, you learn things about it that you would not learn otherwise. If you put the Book of Mormon into a real world context, it should do the same thing for you. One of the ones, for example, and this is one Mark Wright noticed, Alma asks people if they have the image of God engraven on their faces. Okay, that's pretty cool. What we don't realize is that in Mesoamerica, they actually would wear the mask of a god that was engraven, and they have art showing the artists engraving this. And the idea was when you put on this mask of the god, you were becoming like God. And so when it says, do you have the image of God engraven on you? Have you become like God? Oh, yeah. Yeah, okay. That gives me context. And there's any number of them where I found that putting it into a Mesoamerican context will teach me more about the Book of Mormon. And I think that more than anything else tells me that the book took place in that place because we get that confluence of meaning where we start getting more information based on the culture.
Oh, that's good. And usually, like whenever I have an episode on with someone who's an expert in the field, I usually would ask them for any books or articles they would recommend on the topic. So if someone wanted, I know you have a very good book, Tradition of the Fathers, which kind of goes into the Mesoamerican background of the Book of Mormon. So that would be a good volume. Any other volumes would recommend on Book of Mormon historicity, what you would consider to be some of the better material out there?
I hate to say it, but mine's the only one I'd recommend. I, with only minor hesitations, recommend John Sorensen's Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, the earlier one. I do not as heartily recommend his newest one, Mormon's Codex.
It seemed to be a bit rushed.
Yeah. He was more cautious in the first one, and that's better. He was much less so, and there are a couple of places where he's quoting some people that just plain incorrect. So yeah, I don't recommend that one. I'd recommend the earlier one. I have a friend who teaches at BYU and teaches Book of Mormon, and my book's the one he recommends. And Grant Hardy, when he did the Maxwell Institute version of the Book of Mormon and was recommending a source, put mine in there. And that's the only one on that topic. So
no, that's
a bit of hubris to say so, but that's the one I'd recommend.
No, it's okay. I've read it twice. It's a very good book. And if someone were to be curious, like a good book on, say, Mesoamerican studies from like a non-LDS perspective, I know there's loads, but like if there's like a particular one or two you would recommend maybe to a novice who wants to get a good grasp of the field.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody about that, and one of the books that I think, just because of its popularity, is one to recommend is Michael Coe's The Maya. I think it's like in its 9th edition, and anything that's gone through nine editions means that it's relatively popular, and it's been kept up. So it's giving you good information, and apparently written well enough that people are willing to read it. So that's probably a good one. The Maya are much more interesting than anybody else at the moment because we do have monuments. We do have more history that comes from that time period. And for Latter-day Saints, the Maya are much closer in both time and culture to the Book of Mormon than Central Mexico is. Pretty much everything out of Central Mexico is much later. And yeah, the earliest one from Teotihuacan is probably involved in the end of the Book of Mormon, but not any earlier than that.
No, that's perfect. And as I said, like in the show notes, I'll include like a link to your Greg Cofer author page as well as your interpreter page, so people can actually check out your books and your articles. But are you working on any forthcoming projects, like any books or any articles at the moment?
No, nope. It's only been about 3 or 4 weeks that we put those other books to bed, and I'm taking a breath. And this is the first time I think in the last, now not quite 20 years, but it's first time in close to 20 years where I haven't known what I'm going to go work on next. I've usually had a new project ready to go after I finished the last one. This time I don't. So don't know what I'm going to do.
Well, whatever it is, I look forward to it.
Thanks.
But yeah, thanks for coming on again, Brant. Hopefully this overview will be a good counter some well-meaning but errant apologetics on this particular topic. But as I said, I'll include in the show notes links to your material. And thanks again for coming on, and hopefully this will be educational to other people as well.
Hope so.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.